let's get right to it. On the phone with me, I have Gary. Gary's been a fan, been around the wrestling business for how many years, Gary?
Well, dating myself, why not? I started following wrestling at about 5 years old, started getting into it at about 7 years old, and had my first byline in a magazine at the age of 11. Let's say 55 years. 55
years. What magazine did you have your byline in, Gary?
The first one was Ring Wrestling. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, like 1964. And it was a write-up of a TV show I saw from St. Louis, from when we used to get wrestling at the Chase here.
Wow.
And it meant a big deal to me at the time, you know. But
no, it still should. That's huge. Now, Gary, of course, 55 years following wrestling. You've seen a lot of trends. You've seen it all. Today, we just got hit with the news about Buddy Roberts passing away, 65 years old, one of the formerly, I guess, the Freebirds. You said one of the Hollywood Blondes. I just want to talk a little bit about Buddy Roberts because you got to experience him. You got to see him in person, something I never got to do, correct?
Yeah, I saw him early in his career. Matter of fact, during one of my trips out to Minnesota, visiting a good friend of mine, Jim Melby, who was also a very big player in the wrestling business. He was one of Vern's right-hand men as far as publicity and everything, and Jim became the big brother I never had. We had a lot of things in common, and I would go out there and visit him, and we always took in a wrestling show or whatever, usually as part of his assignment, doing the publicity for the AWA. And I do remember seeing him come in at a very younger age. He was Dale Roberts at the time. I believe he had dark hair. Matter of fact, worked as a babyface style. And I believe I did see him in a match, probably about as early as anybody else did. Right after that, he went up to Montreal, took another guy who was an AWA employee named John Sutton up there with him, and they formed a tag team with Jerry Brown out of Kansas City, and they were called the Hollywood Blondes.
Was that Gary?
And Red Sutton became Sir Oliver Humperdinck. It would have been Grand Prix Wrestling. Yeah, it was run by Butcher Vachon. Had something to do with it. I think he might have been the booker.
Yeah, I believe he was the booker. I know I remember reading before that was a really hot period for Quebec when he was there.
It was. They had two groups running. I think Grand Prix had a lot of talent. They had Killer Kowalski on top, Don Leo Jonathan. They first brought Andre the Giant there. They had a lot of the bigger stars at the time, but yet I believe the Rougeau brothers were running in opposition. They were the older promotion, and they still had a pretty good product also. So at the time, we're talking early 70s, 73 or so, Montreal was a hot city.
Well, I think that if I can remember, memory serves me because I wasn't there, but I remember reading that I believe in Quebec isn't that where the Hollywood Blondes, I think they took on, it was like, I want to say it was San Martino and Edward
Carpatio, maybe?
Yeah. I think Killer Kowalski Mad Dog was the grudge match, too, on top of that. But I remember reading...
About right, yeah. Sounds pretty much familiar. They had a lot of talent. And the Hollywood Blondes I don't know if they were the Hollywood Blondes then or if they were just Jerry Brown and Buddy Roberts. But I know people that were up there to cover the matches, and they said that they were a very effective team for two guys who basically this was their big break in the business.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it seems like to me from everything I've read and I've heard. I do know that I think when they were in Quebec for that match we were just talking about, they set an attendance record that I believe it's still to this day was like 30,000 fans or something, which was huge, especially back then with no internet and stuff like that. There was nothing to promote just locally. That's huge.
Yeah, it was just everything was, what the fans saw up there. Everything was territorial, and you found things out back then. I know from my own experience, you found things out by either word of mouth or like what we did was correspond with different wrestling fans, and we would get the news maybe 2-3 weeks after the fact, but still we beat the magazines by a couple of months, and that was how we found our info. We didn't have the internet, and we had to really work for it. It was fun, though. It really was.
Yeah, I do. I'm thinking, too, Gary, as you're saying all this stuff about no internet and all that stuff, the kids have it easy today, definitely, with finding out their history about wrestling, hopefully, if they're listening
they sure
right now.
Do. Yeah.
But, you had to work for it. I know I had to work for it, not as hard as you did, though. But you want to talk about the Hollywood Blondes. When you saw, before he's even a Hollywood Blonde, when you saw Buddy Roberts, Buddy Smith, whatever he was working as, Dale Roberts, Dale Valentine, whatever he was at the time. When you saw him for the first time, what were your impressions of him? Did he stand out to you as somebody that was really good, or was he just like a normal dude?
You know, he kind of did. As far as like the younger guys of the generation, you could tell he had something there. He was working babyface. I remember that. I wish I could remember who I saw him work with, but it kind of escapes me at the time. Hey, man, you got to give me that much. Sometimes being my age, man, you don't remember everything you want to. But I remember that he did kind of stand out. You could see that he was a good hand. He was well-schooled. I didn't think he would ever be like a bigger name, but then when I saw him after that, it would have been about 2 years later, they showed up on Championship Wrestling from Florida as the Hollywood Blondes, and you could see he really progressed a lot in about a 2-year span. So he probably had that ability from day one. It was just a matter of how to channel it. And he needed the right gimmick and, everything else to go along with it. But basically, and the one thing that kind of stood out in his whole career even then was he was the guy, to me, who carried that team.
He was the glue that held it together. He was the guy that maybe had the promo ability or engaging the fans. He was good in the ring. He had it all, kind of.
Yeah, he could. He was the worker. He was the workhorse of that team. Jerry Brown, I always thought was a pretty decent worker also, but not to the degree that Buddy Roberts was. And then on the mic, it was always Sir Oliver doing the talking for them to get them over. And, the typical deal where at the time a team that was maybe knocking at the door, all they needed was a mouthpiece like a manager to get them over the hump. And, I mean, these guys, no pun intended, but these guys were very, very good. They were very capable and very credible. And they weren't the type of team that got pushed because maybe they thought they were going to be popular among a certain group. They could work. They could go out there and make everybody work a good match. They made guys look very good. Roberts always did his whole career. And that was the one thing that I noticed about him. No matter where he went, he was a great hand for doing something like that.
He worked back in the territorial days. He was all over the U.S. He wasn't just in the 70s.
He had a big name and he had a big reputation. The only place I don't remember him ever working was really for the Fed, for Vince Sr. Who knows why? I mean, there were so many guys at the time, and everybody kind of went, wherever they were going to go, wherever they were hot. But, I mean, he worked for Bill Watts, Leroy McGurk promotion down in Oklahoma. He was everywhere, and I think what really got him, really his niche in the business, had to be when they needed a third Freebird, and that was the guy they called, and he was the guy that you could really rely on for in-ring ability. Yeah,
Gary, I think it was Meltzer that was talking about that. He basically said that, that it was crazy because Buddy Roberts' career was kind of going down. Like it was almost the end of it by the 80s or whatever. And then Bill Watts found him and put him with Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes because they were younger heels and they were doing awesome in Mid-South. But then what happened was basically he thought that, I guess, Buddy would be a good influence on there, but there was nothing further from the truth. He actually got them into a little bit of trouble. He didn't keep them out of trouble.
Yeah, I don't know who the influences were at the time. You can, pick your poison. I think the three, from stories I heard, I did have the chance to meet Buddy years ago. Never got into that kind of stuff with him, but I think he was as wild and rowdy as Gordy and Hayes probably were. So they were a good fit, and they were the real deal. The impression I always got, which is kind of neat in a way, was that they were just like their ring characters were. There wasn't much difference. What you got in the ring and what you saw in the interviews and all that was basically what you got outside the ring. There wasn't really much of a difference. The only thing that I thought was kind of a shame was when they did the big run with the Freebirds, which I think was the biggest thing that ever hit Texas wrestling, and maybe some of the people that are older than me would say, well, no, it was Bull Curry back in the 50s, or they could go back and maybe pinpoint certain things, people that lived down there, and maybe it meant more to them. But on a nationwide scale, you can't argue that the Freebirds-Von Erichs feud was one of the best feuds ever that I've ever seen in the business, period. The only problem was what kind of disappointed me in a way was Buddy was always the foil. And I think a lot of that was done to keep Gordy strong because he was a legitimate world title contender, and also to keep Michael Hayes strong because they always wanted that strong force against the Von Erichs.
All right, well,
and Buddy was always the one that sort of was the guy that, tripped on the banana peel. He took the loss, took the falls in the ring, but yet he was also the workhorse for most of the matches.
Well, that says something.
He was a very big addition to that team.
What do you think, though, like with that feud being one of the biggest of all time, what do you think made that feud so successful between the Freebirds and the Von Erichs?
I think it was the whole, here you had these three, white bread, hometown boys made good with the dimple in the cheeks. And all of a sudden, you got three guys coming in who were all, especially Hayes at the time, was so good on the mic. Was such a great heel character. He got me interested in tape trading back in the late 70s, early, in that time period where I got my first VCR.
Yeah.
And couldn't wait to get stuff from Atlanta so we could watch the Freebirds every week. And I think a lot of it had to do with the whole personalities. You had, super good, and then you had super evil, kind of like in an Eddie Haskell type way where smart fans were going to cheer for the Freebirds no matter what, because they were the cool heels at the time. I think they all had their own personalities that were so strong, and Buddy Roberts being like the older guy, because if you remember back in the day, Hayes was always doing interviews talking about his age. We're the two youngest guys here, that's why everybody's against us, that kind of stuff. I think they even did that in their beginnings on the early Tennessee shows they worked. And then you had Hayes, or Roberts, who was this grizzled veteran, the guy who'd been around the block, who could, kick ass on top of it. He was like, I don't know, I can't say a father figure, but he was sort of like the leader of the gang in a way. He was the guy who had the street smarts and, could kind of push them a little bit over, made them even worse than they, probably were before they hooked up with them. I think it was a great mix. I don't think you'll ever see a mix like that again. And even in, you know what, Brian, what's kind of cool was even when you watched the Texas shows in the bleak days, like in the late 80s, early 90s, Roberts was still effective as a Freebird with somebody like King Parsons. Yeah. He always had that kind of appeal that, people took notice to him. And I think they had to respect him. A lot of it had to do with ability and just the fact that who he was. He was, one of the original guys. They had a... he established a lot of credence just with that fact alone.
Would you say essentially Buddy Roberts had two runs? He had his Hollywood Blondes run, and then, he was kind of there, but then the Freebirds took him to the next level, or just two separate, very successful runs?
Exactly. You hit it right on the head, because the Hollywood Blondes were a different type of a team. I think the whole idea was they were going to be this prissy, gorgeous George type duo. Well, if you looked at both of them, they didn't really fit that image that much, but that was kind of like where they were going for, maybe in the very beginning, but then they were both solid workers, the typical blonde-haired heels of the day. And then when Roberts became a Freebird, there was more of an edge to his character, and I think that's where he really stood out. I think that was the cool Buddy Roberts, what we saw in the 80s.
Yeah, you hear that a lot today when a lot of wrestlers say that basically they're most successful when they're themselves with the volumes turned up. And I wonder if he was playing a character as the Hollywood Blonde and the Freebird was more of Buddy, the real Buddy with the volume turned up. You know what I mean?
Very, very easily could have been. And I'm sure the influence of Gordy and Hayes and some of their out-of-the-ring exploits, which, may be basically urban legends and maybe not. They're probably not. But I don't know. I didn't run around drinking with them or anything. But I think it was just, he fit into that role so easily, probably with the two guys he was with. I'm sure there was a lot of camaraderie, and not just, well, he's my tag partner and he travels with us, that type of thing. I don't really know. Michael Hayes would be the guy that would be able to fill in those blanks.
Yeah, we got to get Michael Hayes on here, definitely. Gary, now, I wonder also, when you think about the Freebirds, at the time when the Freebirds came about, you had been watching for years. Was that the first time you remember that sort of edginess, I guess I would call it?
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you how I really got into the Freebirds. My friend Jim Melby, who I mentioned before, had gone down to one of the wrestling fans' conventions in Tennessee. I'm going to say the year was maybe 77, 78. And I don't know if Jim went down to represent the magazine he was working for or if he just went down as a fan. It was probably a combination of both. And when he came back during one of our phone calls, and, it was typical, Jim and I talked a lot about baseball. We talked a lot about music. We were both big music nuts, record collectors, the whole bit. And I remember one of the things he did tell me, we started talking a little bit about wrestling. He was telling me about his trip. And he said to me, Gary, there's two guys down here. The one guy's 18, the one guy's 16. He says, they're unbelievable. He said, they're going to be the real deal. And he said, they're called the Freebirds. He said, you'd love them. They come to the ring to Leonard Skinner's Freebird. I said, I like them already. Never even saw them, didn't know who they were. But then they did a little write-up on the magazine about them. They were like, Jim said, to see them work, they work better than their age. They seem to be really in sync. The first time I'd ever personally seen them was when I was on vacation, I guess it would have been maybe 79, 80, when I saw Atlanta TV, and I saw them for the first time. I'd never seen a heel that was more kind of like a vilified heel than Michael Hayes. He was the cocky, badass type guy, lock up your daughters, lock up your wives. Michael Hayes is coming to town, that kind of thing. And you really took notice. I didn't see them with Buddy Roberts until later. But like I said, when I got my first VCR, the first thing I was looking for was Freebird stuff. It was like, I got to get all this stuff because I want people up here, a lot of my buddies, to come over and check these guys out because they're really a hoot. And like I said, Buddy Roberts was such a big part of that. But to me, the Freebirds were one of the reasons that I really started watching TV wrestling again.
Okay, well, did the Freebirds, back when you first started watching, of course, other than Gorgeous George, I guess, with Pomp and Circumstance, there wasn't much entrance music. And I had heard, I don't know how true this is, but I had heard that the Freebirds were one of the first acts to start using that entrance music. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, they were one of the first. The first that I really remember was probably a gentleman named Bob Harmon out of Ohio, came out here to work in 1971 as Beautiful Bobby, and it was about as close to a gay routine that maybe Vince Sr. would ever get. It was kind of edgy at the time. He came to the ring to some kind of weird music that they termed, I doubt if this was the name, but it added to it, poetic license. I think they called it the March of the Fairies. He was the first one I do remember using this entrance music that all of a sudden, for some reason, that kind of thing irritated people. Maybe because it was against the norm. I don't really know. The other one I know of that used to use entrance music was Ripper Collins in Hawaii at around the same time period. But the Freebirds really were, I think, kind of like when everything went nationwide and people started noticing, to me, they were like the pioneers of that, because all of a sudden after that, everybody had entrance music.
Okay, well, have you talk about tape trading and wanting them on your VCR so you can show your friends. Did you ever get to go experience the Freebirds with Buddy Roberts live in person?
I probably did somewhere down the line, because I know I'd seen them in Florida down there, probably in the mid-'80s. I never saw them when they were really hot. That were, it was like I said, you'd be really anxious to see, whatever tapes came in the mail, and then you pop it on. Even my mom and dad were into it. They thought that they were, they were edgy. They were different than most were at the time. Like I said, I think their age had a lot to do with it. Michael Hayes, I remember, did a lot of quoting from rock and roll standards. He would, quote songs, and kind of reminded me of a guy named Jim Dandy Mangrum from a group called Black Oak, Arkansas. I don't know if you even remember those guys.
No, I don't. I can't say I do.
They actually played the Spectrum a couple times and drew, like a pretty respectable house, maybe 10,000 people in an open floor arena. But he reminded me a lot of them, especially in appearance, with the long blonde hair, the revealing type costumes he wore. he was different at the time, and like I said, it was just such a neat trio. Terry Gordy was this guy who looked like, Michael Hayes would start the fight, Terry Gordy would come in and finish the fight. And like I said, on top of that, then when they added Buddy Roberts, it was like they couldn't do this any better. Whoever designed that and came up with that really did one bang-up job, because I don't think you'll ever see guys like that. And they were also the first three-man team that meant anything. If you remember, one of their gimmicks was that when they won the title, I would assume this would have been in Georgia, when I first started seeing them regularly, the deal was that any two Freebirds could defend the title, which was really a killer for the baby faces, and I'm sure the fans in general, where, well, gee whiz, how do the baby faces know who they're going to wrestle? How do they prepare? Are they wrestling Roberts and Gordy? Are they wrestling Roberts and Hayes, or Hayes and Gordy? It was that little edge, that little heel edge that gave them kind of a one-up, and they took notice to them. They were different in the day. Somebody at that time was a wrestling genius. I'll give it to Hayes, because he's done a lot of things. You can tell he's got a very good wrestling mind, by things he's done. And things that he, says and everything when you see him on TV doing interviews or whatever. But, I mean, to me, Brian, I never saw a team like that. And I saw the Grahams. I saw the Kangaroos. I saw the Bastine brothers. I saw all the cool teams from, like, the mid-'50s as a kid growing up. These guys were head and shoulders above them. And this is everything gets magnified when you're younger, especially when you're a little kid seeing people like Buddy Rogers in person. It's like, it's so larger than life. And here I am, a thinking adult, and all of a sudden these guys are like, hey, wow, man, this is the real deal. These guys are better than almost anybody I'd ever seen before. And I still think that. I mean, to me, I still put them high on the list, maybe at the top of the list for tag teams. They were that good and that effective, and they had such a strong run in Mid-South for Bill Watts. I'm sure they had a great run in the different Tennessee territories when they first really cut their chops. And then Atlanta was nationwide, and I know people all over the country got a chance to see them, and love them or hate them, you had to admire them.
That's you got to, like you hit it right on the head. At least everybody got a chance to see how talented these guys are. But when's the last time you bumped into Buddy?
I ran into Buddy Roberts. It would have been in, I believe, 2007. A gentleman named Bud Carson up in Allentown used to have a lot of wrestlers at his store for guests, and they would do Q&As afterwards. And Buddy came in with Dr. Death Steve Williams, and I believe Hollywood John Tatum and Missy Hyatt were also there. I might have that a little messed up, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was, because it was all people from that general Bill Watts type era. And I had the chance to meet Buddy. It was the first time I'd ever actually picked his brain about anything. He was battling the throat cancer at the time. But he was very, very cordial to everyone, and he answered all your questions. He didn't leave you in the dark about anything. It was a pleasure to meet a guy like that, because I have a lot of respect for guys who have done what they did and their accomplishments, and a lot of the guys might not be my favorites, but I still have to admire what they've done. And Buddy was one of those guys. I liked him a lot. I liked everything he had ever done, because he was different. He stood out. He was a typical blonde-haired guy who stood out above a lot of other, generic blonde-haired guys trying to come out as heels and basically try to do what Buddy Rogers did back in the day. But like I said, he was such a gentleman. He was there for the Q&A. He answered everything for everybody, and it was a pleasure. You could see he was a really decent guy. And to add on to that, one of the things kind of later on in life, I believe Buddy was living in Chicago, and his son was wrestling for a friend of mine's group that was called Windy City Wrestling. Unfortunately, they no longer exist. After 20-some years, they had to finally fold up shop. And Buddy's son was given some tapes that I had sent to a gentleman named Mike Gratchner, who was one of the main players for Windy City. And his son was very impressed with the fact that he got to see on tape his dad work. And it was kind of weird to me. The thing that I took out of that was a lot of the guys in the early days of VCRs and tape trading, and, we had access to tape anything you wanted off of TV. I mean, we kind of take things like that for granted now. But a lot of the guys, I don't think, ever saved their own stuff. And it's kind of a shame because can you imagine the stuff Buddy Roberts could have as his legacy? Just starting with, 1980, the Bill Watts era, working your way all the way up. I mean, the guy was incredible. He was such a big player and had so many big parts in 80s wrestling. You can't really talk about that era without mentioning Buddy.
No, you can't. And I think that it's funny because, like you said, I know the Watts era, he used to just tape over tapes, from what I heard, because they were expensive back then. And I don't think that the guys back then realized, I mean, wrestling was what it was. It was big territorially, it was big around, but I don't think they realized how monstrous it would be taken and how some of them will be looked back on as legends because they were just kind of doing their thing. You know what I mean?
Really, and that's the sad part for collectors. It's a shame because this stuff is just never going to ever be seen again, and all we've got are memories and people passing down the folklore and everything. But it is a shame, and I know at one time Vince McMahon supposedly had tapes going back to the 50s, and he had several copies of each tape to the point where they copied over a lot of them. They kept one or two of the originals, but they bicycled so many tapes around the circuit that they had so many of these they would just reuse. And I think it was the same way with probably all the promotions. You got to remember, it was all territorial. You made a tape, you bicycled it around, you got the tape back maybe a month later. There was no sense keeping that stuff. You might as well just reuse it.
Yeah, I don't think
it's one of those things. It's like in my day, your parents throwing out your baseball cards, which never happened to me, or your parents throwing out your comic books. You wish you could really have something to grasp onto that you could actually sit in your living room and watch this stuff because it's legendary. It really is. I'd love to see somebody come up with a bunch of 50s stuff outside of the things that are, kind of in vogue that you see kind of, make the circuit everywhere else. But there's so much good stuff that was lost. And unfortunately, I guess a lot of the 70s stuff that Buddy did is probably, just a memory right now.
Yeah, not only that, Gary, but I think that a lot of the modern day guys and fans could learn from watching that stuff because there's stuff that might not work today, all of it, but there's stuff you could adapt for today. And Gary, I appreciate you coming on. You're like the wrestling encyclopedia to me. I got a lot of respect for you.
You're being too kind now, man.
No, you really are. You really are. You've been through it, and you have so many interesting tales to tell. And I hope we can get you back on again soon, man. Because just what you told us there was awesome.
Thank you for asking me. I love to talk this stuff, and like I said, it's all my opinion. Maybe people disagree. Hey, that's cool, man, if you do. But, hey, that's the way I see things, just that way. And try to call it straight shot. It means a lot to me.
Yeah.
Like I said, I don't watch the current product very rarely, but the old stuff, man, I loved it.
Definitely shines through when you talk to us about it. So, like I said, we'll get you on again soon. We'll try to bring you on once every couple of weeks if that's cool.
Hey, definitely, man. You call the shots, man. And I'd be happy to accommodate you guys.
Thanks, man. Definitely a good time talking to you. We'll catch up soon, all right, Gar? See you, man.
So.